pawn e4, pawn e5, knight f3, pawn d6, pawn d4, knight c6, pawn c3, knight f6, bishop d3, bishop g4, castles kingside, pawn takes d4, pawn takes d4, bishop takes f3, pawn takes f3, knight takes d4, queen a4, knight c6, bishop b5, queen d7, rook d1, pawn a6, pawn e5, knight h5, bishop g5, pawn h6, rook a1, c1, rook c8, queen e4, pawn f5, pawn takes f6, king f7, bishop c4, pawn d5, rook takes d5, queen e6, rook d7, pawn e4, pawn e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, pawn b4, bishop takes b4, pawn c3, bishop a5, castles kingside, knight f6, knight g5, castles kingside, pawn f4, pawn h6, knight takes f7, rook takes f7, bishop takes f7, king takes f7, pawn takes e5, bishop b6, pawn d4, knight takes e5, queen h5, knight g6, pawn e5, pawn c5, pawn takes f6, pawn takes f6, bishop takes h6, pawn d5, bishop g5, pawn e4, pawn e5, Knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, pawn b4, bishop b6, pawn a4, pawn a6, pawn d4, pawn takes d4, pawn c3, pawn d6, queen b3, queen e7, castles kingside, bishop e6, pawn a5, bishop a7, pawn b5, bishop takes c4, queen takes c4, knight e5, knight takes e5, pawn takes e5, pawn takes a6, pawn c6, rook b1, rook b8, pawn takes b7, rook takes b7, queen takes c6, rook d7, rook b7, king d8, bishop a3, queen e6, rook takes d7, queen takes d7, queen a8, queen c8, queen takes a7, queen c7, queen a8, king d7, rook b1, pawn e4, pawn e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, pawn b4, bishop takes b4, pawn c3, bishop a5, castles kingside, bishop b6, pawn d4, pawn d6, pawn takes e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, pawn takes e5, bishop takes f7, king e7, queen b3, knight f6, bishop a3, pawn c5, rook a1, d1, queen c7, pawn f4, rook f8, bishop c4, rook d8, rook d1, e1, bishop d7, bishop c1, rook f8, pawn takes e5, queen takes e5, bishop f4, queen h5, rook d1, king d8, pawn e5, knight e8, queen a4, queen g4, pawn e6, knight f6, rook takes d7, king c8, queen c6, pawn takes c6, bishop a6, pawn e4, pawn e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, pawn d6, pawn c3, knight f6, queen b3, queen e7, castles kingside, pawn a6, pawn d4, pawn b6, bishop d3, pawn h6, pawn d5, knight d8, bishop d2, knight b7, queen a3, knight c5, bishop c2, knight c5 takes e4, bishop takes e4, knight takes e4, queen a4, pawn b5, queen takes e4, pawn f5, queen c2, pawn g5, rook f1, e1, queen f7, pawn c4, bishop e7, pawn takes b5, queen takes d5, rook a1, d1, queen takes b5, pawn a4, queen b7, knight takes e5, pawn takes e5, rook takes e5, rook h7, queen c4, king f8, rook takes e7, rook takes e7, bishop b4, bishop e6, queen c3, pawn c5, queen f6, bishop f7, queen takes h6, king g8, Queen takes g5. King h7. Rook d3. Bishop g6. Rook h3. King g7. Bishop c3. King f7. Queen f6. King e8. Queen takes g6. Rook f7. Queen e6. Queen e7. Rook h8. Rook f8. Queen c6.